Today's presentation is by Gayle Wells and Pat McCord, Amacher, authors of The Only Woman in the Room, the Norma Paulus story. This is part of our speaker series, which focuses on Women's History Month. It's March. Next week, we are excited to bring Bev Clarno here on Tuesday, March 20th at noon for her autobiography. This series is sponsored by and brought to you under the Capital History Gateway Project. If you have a chance, you should check out the events page at OregonCapital.com to see all the programs and events we have planned for this year. Gayle Wells is the author of The Tillamook, A Created Forest Come of Age, and co-author of Lewis and Clark Meet Oregon's Forests. She worked for Oregon State University's College of Forestry for 15 years as editor, writer, and finally director of Forest Communications. Since 2002, she has been a freelance writer and editor specializing in history and cultural resources. She lives in Corvallis. Pat McCord Amacher is a former newspaper reporter and teacher of writing who works in business communications and writes freelance in creative nonfiction. Over her 30 years in Oregon as a transplanted Midwesterner, she has developed a special interest in the state's history and art. I also should note that today is Norma Paulus's 85th birthday, and we want to wish her a happy birthday. So with that, I welcome Gayle and Pat. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. If I fade out, let me know, and I'll lean over to the microphone. I'm Gayle Wells. My partner and I, Pat Amacher, wrote this book. Norma Paulus wrote this book, but we basically put it into words for her, The Only Woman in the Room, the Norma Paulus story. Just a few points of sequence. I would like to read a short overview of her life for those who are not as familiar with her accomplishments as we are. And then Pat is going to talk a little bit about certain parts of her career, and I will come back and talk about certain other parts of her career, and then after about 40 minutes we will entertain questions. If you would please silence your cell phones, that would be courteous for everybody. This is a piece that I wrote about Norma recently for the Oregon Encyclopedia. And it is just a very brief overview of her life, but I think it'll give you a little context for what we're talking about. Throughout the 1970s through the early 2000s, Norma Paulus was one of a cohort of Oregon political leaders whose efforts to advance women's rights, environmental protection, quality education, and government transparency helped to cement the state's progressive reputation. Norma Jean Peterson was born on March 13th, 1933, in Belgrade, Nebraska. The family moved to Oregon in 1936. They settled first in Eugene. It was not an easy time to make a living, but Paul Peterson, her father, picked hops and sold insurance, moved the family to a homestead near Bend in the hope of striking oil, which never happened. Early on, Norma was an exceptional student. She made a remark sometime in her career that she never knew of a time when she didn't think she was going to amount to something, and she certainly did. She graduated from high school at 17, but because college was financially out of reach for the family, she worked as a secretary for the Harney County District Attorney. 2 years later, she contracted polio and was hospitalized in Portland for several weeks, spent 2 years recovering at home, and credits her own determination and positive attitude for a full recovery from polio as a young woman. She moved to Salem in her early 20s, worked as a secretary for Earl LaTourette, who was the Chief Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court. Impressed with her intelligence and drive, he helped her apply to Willamette University, I believe the first woman to be admitted and to matriculate at Willamette School of Law. She had not done the little previous record of having gotten a undergraduate degree. She just went straight into Willamette Law, graduated with honors, and married a fellow student, William G. Paulus, in 1958. Had 2 children, Fritz and Elizabeth. In 1964, she got into politics when she campaigned for her law school classmate, Wallace P. Carson, for a seat in the House. He was elected. She was hooked on politics. She ran for her own House seat in 1970, served in the legislature till 1975. In 76, she was elected Secretary of State, another first, the first woman to be elected to a statewide public office in Oregon. Pat will talk a little bit more about her accomplishments as Secretary of State. In 1986, she lost her campaign for governor to Neil Goldschmidt in a very close, hard-fought race. Goldschmidt subsequently appointed her to the Northwest Power Planning Council, which is now called the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, where she served through 1989. In 1990, she was elected Superintendent of Public Instruction, and during her 2 terms there, she championed a revamping of the state's educational system. Entered the Republican primary in 1995 to fill Bob Packwood's seat, but did not survive the primary. Continued in 1999 until she retired, and to care for her husband Bill, who had been diagnosed with brain cancer, and he died in March of 1999. She directed the Oregon Historical Society for 2 years, from 2001 to 2003, and she is now retired from public life, but she has spoken out from time to time on issues that she cares about. Pat.
Thank you so much for coming, even you. When we started this project, as we say in the preface to the book, we knew that Norma's oral histories, which were taken by the Oregon Historical Society between years 1999 to 2010, sporadically, was going to be our Norma. It was going to be her voice that we needed to find in order to frame her part of Oregon history, her singular part of Oregon history. This is a transcript of that oral history. Each one of these little tabs means something to me. We dove into this history and we absorbed it as best we could, and then we found context and events that she talked about, and we elaborated on them from the book. Now, what I really love about Norma's career is her years as Secretary of State, because I think that they are the most emblematic of Norma's can-do attitude. She had this work ethic that was unstoppable. If she saw something that needed doing, she got it done. And she didn't do it nefariously. There was no skullduggery. That was one of her nice words. But she got it done. And I think this is what will live on in memory of people who know her and who worked with her. When she came to Secretary of State, she thought that she would be most interested in the audits, because that was the money, and that was what people weren't paying attention to, and they needed to pay attention to. So I'd like to read from her description, her own words. This was recorded in 2003, of how she came to decide to run for Secretary of State and how she pictured her job there. And then what happened afterwards, because, as she says, it turned into an avocation I don't think she was really expecting in every detail. Norma, in her own words, says, "The more I'd gotten into state government, the more I realized, while I was convinced we had an honest government, there was no accountability, because there just simply wasn't a system that would allow that kind of accountability, and nobody paid attention to the audits. That was a constitutional function of the Secretary of State. So I paid a lot of attention to that, and I knew a lot about the state system, and then I decided that I was going to run." So the day she starts, she says, "At the same time that I became Secretary of State, I didn't have any furniture. And the reason I didn't have a stitch of furniture in this lovely office in the Capitol was that because when Clay Myers was elected as treasurer, and Jim Redden, these are her predecessors, went to the bench of the Supreme Court, Jim Redden took his desk of things with him to the Supreme Court, and then Clay called me and asked if he could take his desk. And I said yes, thinking there had to be some money in the budget for me to buy a desk and chair at least. Well, when I went in, I had a telephone, because these men had changed offices and taken everything with them. To Clay's credit, he asked me before he did it, but I had no idea that I had no money. So I thought, well, when I was a lowly little secretary in the Supreme Court, I know that our attic in the Supreme Court building was just filled with antique furniture, because men would come in and they would want formica and steel chairs or something, and they'd send these 100-year-old desks and chairs upstairs. Well, I thought, I'll just go search the attics and find myself some furniture. I did find one roll-top desk that had survived the fire in 1935, And I sent it out to be refinished, but it wasn't functional. It was just a ceremonial thing. So I found to my great surprise that everything had been taken out of all the attics of all the state buildings and had been sold as surplus property. Starting to steam now. Now I go into antique stores all the time. I'm an antique nut and a junker, and I was just hitting my stride with that when I started as Secretary of State. So I noticed that I'd go into antique stores and find some of the chandeliers that had come out of the basement or the bronze doorknobs with the seal on them. As I investigated this, I found out a couple of things. Number one, when they'd renovated the basement in '71 to provide some carrels as offices, the salvage company had the right to take all those doors and light fixtures that they didn't reuse and these doorknobs that later cost the state $120 per doorknob to replace them. Anyway, that was perfectly legal because the people who were running the legislature were men. And they had no appreciation for this, and they didn't pay any attention to details. Then the other thing that was happening was that property managers would see this stuff up in the attics of these buildings and say, oh, who needs this old revolving oak bookcase? Who needs this desk? Never mind that it was one where Oswald West sat. And they literally sold that in public auction to antique dealers or to anybody who would buy it. They often just sold it for a song. Then the other thing that was happening is that legislators would decide that they would take some of it home. Or people would sit on a certain chair for years and years and years and think it was theirs and take it home. It was just all disappearing in front of our eyes. As a matter of fact, my husband's Uncle Fred was Deputy State Treasurer for 35 years. When he heard the Capitol was on fire in the mid-30s, he rushed right down and he found a couple of men, citizens, and they ran into his office. They took all the documents relating to the investment of public funds and crammed them into this desk and into boxes. And then he had some Willamette students carry the desk out on the lawn while the fire was raging. Years later, while Straub was treasurer and Fred had left, Straub used that desk that had survived the fire. And when Governor Straub retired, he took the desk with him. Then he had his staff put it on surplus property, and he bought it for $300, and now it's residing in Governor Straub's house as his personal property. And there are hundreds of examples like that. So anyway, this is an important factor that I soon discovered when trying to furnish my own office with the relics of the past that belonged to the state. I found that they were all gone, and I was so outraged and disturbed by it that I went to Victor, who was Governor Atiyeh, and told him I was going to introduce a bill creating the Historical Properties Commission. First time ever. And I was going to name myself chairman of it, and I needed a half-time person to help, and I didn't want it in my budget because the executive branch kept track of the surplus property. So I wanted to put this half-time person in the executive branch's surplus property unit so we could go out and tag what few things were left of our history. Pictures, paintings, artifacts, furniture, ribbons, mementos, all those things. And then put red flags on them to make certain the property management system wasn't selling them. Well, we were in a depression. Victor was lobbing off all kinds of salaried possessions. I knew that the job I was requesting wouldn't be in his budget, even though he agreed to put it in, and he would lose control of it because in the last hours of the session, his managers would give up my position before they'd give up one of their own, you know. So I went to Glenn Oda, who was very interested in history. He was a very fine legislator, a Democrat. And then Debs Potts from Grants Pass, who was very, very interested in this issue. And I told Debs and Glenn what I wanted to do. And I said, I don't want any money. I can get volunteers to help me do this. But I've got to have a part-time position. And I explained why it couldn't be in my office, why it had to be in the property office. And they said, consider it done. So I introduced the little bill, and nothing was ever said. The day of the session, it passed both houses, just like that, and Deb Potts put that position in the last minute in the budget. So then I asked Governor McKay's daughter and Mrs. Patterson and 3 or 4 other citizens, women, who knew something about politics, but knew a lot about antiques, and then historian Cecil Edwards and the head of the National Guard's Military Reserve. The reason I did this is because I wanted the National Guard to help me, because the National Guard had manpower and trucks and stuff and cranes. They were very helpful. Anyway, I created the Historical Properties Commission, and with 2 legislators on it. Then I got the National Guard to provide us with transportation and drive us to all these places. We systematically went through the Capitol and all the buildings on the mall and the state hospital and the prisons. And then we went to the universities and the outlying areas. And we went to what is now a prison over in Pendleton, but it was then a mental institution. We inventoried and tagged on paper what we found, which was really pretty pitiful. But there were some exciting things that we found too. When One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was filmed at the State Hospital in Salem, there was a man who had been director of the State Hospital for years. His name was Brooks, and he was an antique collector and a film buff. And he would find things that other people were throwing away and put them in a series of tunnels under the State Hospital. No one at the State Hospital, there was a new director by that time, was forthcoming with that information. So when we went to the State Hospital, we didn't know about that room down there. But when we left there, I got a call that night from a man who worked there. He said, "Mrs. Paulus, I know what you're trying to do, and I approve of what you're trying to do to stop the disappearance of all these things." So he told me about this room underneath the State Hospital, and I asked Cecil Edwards, who knew everything. He didn't know about it. And we went out there and went up to the State Hospital, and I asked the new director to take us down into the tunnel and show us the room. He said he didn't know anything about a room down there. I said, well, we'll just have to go find it. I can't remember whether he changed his attitude then or not, but at any rate, we did go down in the tunnels and we found this room. There were all kinds of stuff there, including things left from the Centennial exhibition. But the most notable thing we found was a painting, very big. It was dusty and very dark down there, and when I held the picture up to the light and I said, "Cecil, this looks like an oil painting." He said, "I think you're right." I said, "Well, who is it?" He said, "I have no idea who it is. Maybe it's one of the superintendents of the State Hospital." So something just told me to take it. Well, the new director was very upset. And I said, "Well, I'm the Secretary of State. The Constitution makes me the archivist, and I have the authority through the legislature to identify historical properties. I'll give you a receipt for it, but I'm taking it with me." Then I called Tom Vaughn, a noted historian, and asked him when he was coming to the Capitol. He came within the next few days. I said, "Good. If you can't, I've got a portrait here. I can't figure out who it is." Well, he walked in the door and said, "My God, this is Oswald West, early governor of Oregon." So Tom brought it, took it and had it cleaned and reframed, and it was all I could do to get it back from him. Then I decided the Capitol should have pictures of all the governors. So this became her mission. I got a call from another person who said, "You should go up to the Willamette Waller Hall," because I remember as a young boy that when the Capitol burned, the Willamette students took paintings out of the burning Hall of Representatives and put them at Willamette. So I went over to talk to Bill's Uncle Fred. He said, "Well, that's true. I know that I personally saw a couple of them leaned up against trees. They ran in and grabbed a couple of them off the wall, but they didn't save all of them, not nearly all of them." He said, "I think there were Willamette students that were taking them across the street," which would make a lot of sense. So I was a trustee at Willamette, and I went up there, and we couldn't find anything. But one day, when I was out at McLaren for some kind of meeting, there was this big old oil painting hanging there, and I asked who it was, and the man said, "I don't know who it is, but it came from Willamette University." Somebody brought it out here a long time ago. So I thought, oh my God, this has to be one of the paintings. We brought it to the Capitol. Once again, I called Tom Vaughn, and he came down and he said, "That's Thomas Gere, another governor." He was a governor very favorably disposed to women at the turn of the century. His portrait now hangs on the Senate side. So now we had Thomas Gere and we had Oswald West. Then an artist by the name of Sewell from Coos Bay called me and said that he had been commissioned by a special act of legislature to paint a painting of Julius Meyer, the first independent and first Jewish governor that we had, and that he had painted it, and he wanted to know where it was. Why wasn't it in the Capitol? He said, "Last time I was there weren't any portraits." I said, "I didn't know." He sent me a copy of the actual bill that the legislature passed. They paid him $3,000 to paint it. He had a copy of the canceled check. So I had evidence that there was a painting someplace. I called Jack Meyer, whom I'd known through some environmental conservatives. He said, "You know, when the new Capitol was erected, the people that were running it called us and told us they didn't want the picture anymore and to come and get it. Last time I saw it, it was hanging in Meyer and Frank's basement." I said, "I want to go get it. Is that all right with you? We want to hang it in the Capitol." He said, "I think his family would be very pleased to have it back where it was supposed to be." The new Capitol had been designed so they wouldn't have any stuff like that, portraits and things hanging around. Anyway, I went down to Meyer and Frank and got the painting and took it back. We had it cleaned, and now it hangs to the right of the governor's office. I think it's a wonderful painting. Also at that time, Tom McCall was dying. I was scrounging around on the portrait project because I was busy with all the timber stuff and the auditing and the election stuff. But this was an avocation I'd created for myself out there. So I thought, if Tom McCall is dying, we've got to get a portrait of him. I called some people and told them what I was up to. Of course, I talked to Victor about this because he and I were really good friends and he was a history buff. I raised the money privately. Then I came to Tom Vaughn and said, I've got some money. We're going to get Tom's portrait painted, and I'm not even going to ask anybody. We don't have time. I've made the decision. We've got the money. Tom gave me the names of 3 people, one of whom was Hank Pander. I went to visit him. I looked at some of his paintings, and I thought if there were anybody who could immortalize Tom McCall, it's probably him. Hank Pander said yes. I called Audrey McCall and asked if Tom was home. Could I bring this painter up? And if Tom would let him sketch? She said, of course. And the governor welcomed it. So I took Hank Pander up there and introduced him. And Hank just sat there and sketched as rapidly as he could. Tom was excited about it. When the painting was done, it was large and had a kind of a surreal look to it. It has a very ravaged face, which Audrey did not like at all. But that's what Tom looked like. So when Hank had finished it, I called Audrey up and said, could we make arrangements to have Tom come down and see this portrait? I want him to look at it before we do anything with it. She said yes. He got dressed in a suit and tie. And I can't remember whether Victor had the state police pick him up or what. But anyway, down he came. It was in the evening. I had my friend Joe there with me and David Roten, who I had involved in all this stuff. And they were going to help us hang it. I have a picture taken that night, and nobody else has this picture except Hank. But it's of Tom standing next to his portrait. So when he looked at it, he was kind of shocked. But I said, Tom, this painting is going to create so much controversy. And he said, there is nothing that would tickle me more than to be able to create controversy after I'm dead. So we had the unveiling of it, and Audrey did not like it. She never liked the painting, but I think it's really quite wonderful. The other thing that was really interesting in my forays into the world of discarded and disposable surplus property was when I discovered the state was paying a lot of money to store the leftover marble squares from when the wings were added. And I should summarize this because I'm running out of time. Anyway, the surplus property people were upset about the marble. They had no way to move it. Nobody wanted it. It was costing them a lot of money and space. So she thought, being the old junker, I'm back on her voice now, I thought to myself, I could sell that marble, and I could take the proceeds from the marble and commission artists to paint Hatfield and Attia and Straub. So I went to Victor and told him what my idea said, and he said that sounded great. And she publicized it through Bend. She put it in all the papers of the state, and they had a giant garage sale on the Capitol grounds. The National Guard helped out once again. So people came, and I said, if you buy it, you have to move it out of there. And one of the men I saw was this tall, handsome young man with long curly hair. Just a handsome man. And he'd just been there about 2 hours all by himself, just looking at the marble. So when we had our lull, I went over to him and asked him what he did. And he said he wanted to buy some marble, but he only had $50. I said, well, how good are you? He said, I'm really good. I'm just really poor. He said he only had $50, so I said, I'll tell you what. You can have a piece of marble that you can carve someone's bust out of. And if you find a piece of marble that would work for the bust of one of the Oregon's governors, and you will carve it, I will give you 3 or 4 pieces of this smaller marble, but you have to agree to do that for $50. And he came back and said, I'll do it. So he gave me his $50. I took the piece, marked it out for him, and then I got on the phone to Mark Hatfield, because he was the elder statesman. She wanted to give him first chance. I said, I've got this surplus marble from the back of the Capitol, and I have money either to have your portrait painted by an artist or you can have a marble bust. He said, I'll go for the marble. It's more eternal. I said, well, the only other catch is I've already chosen the sculptor. So anyway, the likeness, I think, is excellent of Mark, except it has him with his mouth open. Ken Hunt did it deliberately as if he were speaking because he's known as such an orator. So I don't know whether Mark likes it or not, but it's in the Capitol and it's in the governor's office. And I called Victor and Bob Straub and let them choose their own artists. And I don't like Bob's and I don't like Victor's, but that was their choice. They chose the artist, and we paid for that out of the proceeds of the marble sale. When they're finished talking about Secretary of State, her interviewer, Clark Hansen from the OHS, says, I guess seeing how you were able to operate in these situations, it made me think of a question maybe I could frame a little bit better. But do you recall the best example of something you might have done that was technically not legal, but you knew it was good to have done, so you went ahead and did it anyway? No, she said, never. I always got the authority to do it, because if you don't like the way something is, you change it. That's Norma.
Well, Pat has given you a really good idea of Norma's vivid, immediate presence, and this came through very strongly in this 300 and some page oral history that Clark Hansen took from her over the space of 12 or 13 years at the Oregon Historical Society. We really tried to capture that voice in telling her story. We did not, we tried at first to do a first person, sort of simulate a first person narrative, and it just simply didn't work. We just didn't feel like we could channel Norma in that way. But we did try to capture her as vividly as we could in telling about her in the third person. And so having said that, three basic major threads in her life that stood out very strongly for me was, one was her embodiment of a very practical feminism. The second one was her absolute integrity in everything that she did. And the third one was her absolute commitment to, how do I say it, practical citizen-led democracy. And all of those things really permeated everything that she did while she was in public service and also in her private life as well. So I'm going to read a few passages from areas in the book that I think illustrate those themes, and as best I can, as best we could, cast them in Norma's own very eloquent voice. I'm going to talk a little bit about her attitude toward feminism first. Education was the cause closest to Norma's heart when she entered politics. The advancement of women became a passionate concern throughout her public life. Oregon's environment was the third star in her crown of convictions. Her environmental ideals were pragmatic, rooted in her impoverished upbringing and in her deep respect for the productive capacity of Oregon's land and waters. She could not abide waste, whether it took the form of paving over prime farmland for suburban neighborhoods or something as seemingly trivial as excessive packaging of grocery items. She made headlines in her first campaign for the legislature by carrying a sack of groceries into a Rotary Club meeting where she was scheduled to give a campaign speech. Now, in those days, of course, the Rotary was a men's club, so she was the only woman there, the only woman in the room so many times in her life. This is her talking. I took $50 of my grocery money and went to Ross IGA and bought examples of all the bad packaging that was just coming onto the market. When I was giving my speech, I started taking these things out of a brown bag. And then I'd have to stop and pound these things with a hammer to take them out of the plastic. Norman continued calmly with her speech as she wrestled to separate each item from its packaging. She placed the goods and the packaging in separate piles on either side of the lectern. By the time I'd finished my speech, she said, the plastic was this high. And she said, have I made my point? Her audience was, of course, all men. Women could not belong to the Rotary Club in those days. So I said to them, you as husbands, as people watching your purse strings, you ought to go home and help your wife deal with this problem because it's costing you money. So this is 1970, and this is how she approaches this feminist issue. It's the environment certainly was a cause dear to her heart, but I'm really making the point here about her evolving feminism. Then there's another passage that shows how it really smacks her in the face, the sexism, as she runs for her first, excuse me, I should have marked these, but I didn't. I know, it's just too late now. Norma was accustomed, and I'm speaking again about the same time, she's running for the legislature in 1970. Norma was accustomed to seeing herself first as an individual with more than average energy and talent, and only secondarily as a member of a socially defined class called women. So when she started her political career in the late 1960s, as the second wave of feminism was cresting the reefs of American culture, she kept her distance at first. It wasn't that she clung to old restrictive views about a woman's place. On the contrary, her own life demonstrated what a woman could do if she applied brains, passion, and energy to any endeavor to which her heart calls her, whether in the house or in the house. But she had suffered only lightly the sting of discrimination, which may be why the feminists' complaints of pervasive sexism, their exhortations to solidarity, and their more attention-getting demonstrations left her cold. If you asked me in 1970 what I thought about the feminist mystique, which is Betty Friedan's groundbreaking 1963 book, she recalled, I would have said, I don't have time to read frivolous things because I never felt that I had been discriminated against. When she ran for office, her bubble burst. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for the blatant sexism she encountered on the campaign trail. It just hit me square in the face, she said. It was staggering to me that the only thing keeping me back from getting people's votes was that I was a woman. It turned me inside out overnight. She went on to form the Women's Political Caucus in the House in the 1971 and 73 sessions with a whole raft of very powerhouse women on both sides of the aisle. Mary Reekie, Mary Burroughs, Pat Whiting, Vera Katz, Betty Roberts, and Betty Brown, and Mary Wendy Roberts, who was Betty's daughter-in-law, more or less. So, odd relationship. But the point is that they were able to reach across the aisle in those days for a purpose that all of them embraced, and they worked within the system, but forcefully within the system, and with a lot of sympathetic male legislators as well, to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, to endorse the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course ultimately did not gain the required 2/3 votes to pass it to become an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But this illustrates her starting point, I think, for her very effective practical feminism. More about her environmentalism. I'll read you a little bit about the famous bottle bill, which passed, I think it was in 1973. And this was, am I wrong about that? I think that was the session when McCall brought it forward, and it was part of a whole ideology for her about, again, not wasting. Let me see, excuse me, 74, 75. Okay. Norma always understood the bottle bill as a step toward a larger environmental vision. She understood and shared the average Oregonian's revulsion to seeing garbage all over the roads, trails, and waterways, which was one of the ostensible triggers for the bottle bill, was to get rid of the litter all over the place. That was the reason the bottle bill passed, she said. It was because of litter in the minds of the public. But those of us who were more visionary, people like Betty Roberts and me, were viewing it as a first step toward a real recycling and energy conservation policy. She and Roberts, she noted, were children of the Great Depression. We used to recycle pop bottles and everything all the time. For us, it was about conservation of natural resources, not just litter. Governor McCall was ecstatic about the success of the bottle bill, and this was 71, well pleased with the rest of 1971's legislative environmental accomplishments, so it was in the 71 session. The ecological package seemed almost divinely inspired, and this is McCall talking, led off as it was by the B legislation of bonds, bottles, billboards, bicycles, and boats. So by the end of the 71 session, Norma's standing with the environmental community was as high as it could be, remarkable for a mid-Willamette Valley Republican lawmaker and a freshman at that. When the Oregon Environmental Council ranked the 1971 legislators according to their environmental voting record, only 3 legislators were giving perfect scores: Nancy Fadley, Keith Skelton, and Norma Paulus. And at the end of that session, she was awarded the Outstanding Freshman Award, Outstanding Freshman Legislator Award. So she learned very quickly how to become an effective legislator. She was not ego-driven. She did her homework. She studied. It also helped that she was a very gifted speaker, and so she certainly made her mark right away. What else did I say about her absolute integrity? Yes, I'd like to, I think I've got a few more minutes, and I'd like to read a little bit about how she stuck to her principles. One of the very interesting things about this period of history is how I think a lot of people have commented on this, how in those days we had progressive Republicans and maybe what you might call slightly conservative Democrats working side by side, and the pool was just very large and there was a lot of overlap. And there were a lot of issues that most people could agree on. It probably helped that the economy was doing pretty well in those days, and McCall was a very popular governor, a Republican progressive governor. And so as the decades went by, Norma noticed that what was called Republican was getting more and more like this. And she kind of stayed close to her small government, citizen-driven, practical form of conservative, really right up to the end of her public life. So I'd like to read you a little bit about how that shift happened with her. 229. Okay. Norma still made headlines after she retired from public life. In 2014, she came out for Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley in his re-election bid against his challenger, Portland physician and first-time political hopeful Monica Waby. Norma was one of 5 co-leaders of the group Women for Merkley. The other 4 are prominent women in politics, Democrats all, including former Governor Barbara Roberts and former Superintendent of Public Instruction Susan Castillo. That Norma Paulus would endorse a male Democratic incumbent over a female Republican challenger says a lot about how politics has shifted in the last 40 years. Norma was a progressive Republican at a time when such a stance had a broad appeal across the Oregon electorate. She was a member of a well-regarded political tribe that included leaders like Tom McCall, Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood, and Dave Frohnmeyer. Those were days, Frohnmeyer said, when you didn't have to worry about crossing a party line for a good idea. That Norma was a woman gave her an opportunity to expand the Republican Party's embrace and soften its more masculine edges. For example, her tireless advocacy of public schools gave her common ground, at least early on, with teachers and their union. And it also made a persuasive case for public support of education to more conservative citizens who may not have approved of unions in general. Similarly, she was able to embody feminism's potentially divisive agenda from a centrist, non-ideological stance. Throughout her career, her progressive ideas were very much of a piece with her conservative instincts. Her conservatism shows in the deep-seated sense of the democratic ideal, her faith that ordinary people can be trusted to decide for themselves what's best for themselves and their community. She believed in keeping power local and vesting it in the hands of elected representatives of state governments or federal agencies. Yet, she is no small government libertarian. She strongly believes in the bond of community and in people's responsibility to care about their neighbors. If private virtue is not getting the job done, she has no qualms about using state power to secure the welfare of society's less powerful citizens. That shows clearly in her tireless work for equal opportunities for Oregon's women and people of color, educational excellence for Oregon's children, and protection for Oregon's environment. She tells a story on herself that maybe more than she knows, illustrates her special take on the proper balance between public regulation and private responsibility. Having worked hard as a legislator to make public facilities accessible to disabled people, she drove into a store's parking lot one day and noticed a car pulling into a spot reserved for disabled drivers. A disabled parking permit hung from its rearview mirror. She watched as 2 able men got out and loped into the store. Norma parked her car, marched in after them, and patrolled the aisles until she caught up with them. Then she gave them a furious dressing down. The young men, abashed, went out and moved their car. There's so much more we could talk about. But we're getting near the time when we should be ready for questions. And so I think I'd like to ask Pat to come back up, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. And if any of you has memories of Norma that you'd like to share, that would also be good. We'll need to remind us to repeat questions and comments so that our remote audience can hear. Yes.
Well, she had another garage sale, and I was on the Pittsburgh Properties Commission.
What's your name?
Frankie Bell.
Oh, Frankie.
Frankie Bell is speaking.
Yes, of course.
She had another garage sale, says Frankie.
Yeah. It was the Eastern Oregon State Hospital, and we volunteers went over there, and we had a garage sale. They had all this really awful stuff, but it went, and people bought all sorts of things. And that evening, we went to the local tavern, and the Rainbow Room. And some fella came over and asked her to dance, and she did. We had a great time. Every time we were with Norma, we always had fun, because we love to have fun.
So Frankie's story, let me just recap that.
Oh.
Can I just?
Go ahead, yes.
Frankie talked about going over to Eastern Oregon State Hospital in Pendleton and having this garage sale with not always really beautiful things, but they all went and they had a great time. They went to the Rainbow Room, and Norma danced with the stranger who asked her to dance because she was a fun-loving person, and she certainly was. Thank you, Frankie.
I was going to talk today about the black marble sale of the black marble. She called it a mop board, and she talks about how you were running the gift shop, and this black marble that was salvaged found somebody to cut it up and engrave it and sold as paperweights.
Right.
In the
state seal on some and the Oregon beaver
Yeah.
on the other.
Just, I mean, how much more frugal can you get, you know?
Surreptitiously put his initials on it.
Oh, really? Well, it's just amazing to me hearing stories about how it was like she had a giant house and she was taking care of every bit of it, you know, and that was her job, was to keep everything in order.
So could you share with the remote audience about the paperweights?
Oh, yes, the black marble paperweights, and the marble came from, where was that marble from? Oh, when they put the wings on, and of course she didn't want to throw that away, so she found a way. She found someone with a special saw that could carve it up, and someone who could emboss it with the seal and what was the other thing?
The beaver.
Oh, the beaver.
Yeah, the flag.
And to sell them in the gift shop, and they just sold really well, right, and made some money there. So.
Most of that money went for portraits.
Oh, good.
Oh, yes.
There you go.
Most of the money went for portraits.
The money
says
went for the
Frank.
portraits,
Yes,
yes.
which Pat covered in her
Yeah.
reading.
A great mission.
Yeah.
I'll tell a story if it's fun to do it.
Why don't you come up here?
Can you come up here? Yeah.
No, that's not fair. Frankie didn't have to.
You can do better than
Well, we don't want to tell your story. You tell your story.
Tell us who you are, too.
Sure. My name is Darrell Fuller. I'm a lobbyist. I was a student at Willamette when Norma ran for governor, so she was one of the first campaigns I ever got a chance to work on. I still have a Nowhere Loves Norma button somewhere. I wish I could have found it and brought it with me, because I collect campaign buttons. I don't have it. But my story actually goes back further than that. I had the opportunity as a student at Willamette to intern for Congressman Bob Smith in Washington, D.C. And as the low man on the totem pole, one of the first jobs I got was a box of old photos that I was supposed to catalog and identify and put in an album for him. And so through the staff and other people, we would identify the pictures as they came. There was one photo, we couldn't figure out who all was in it. We knew Bob was in it. It was an old picture from his days in Burns. And we finally had to go to the congressman and ask him who was in the picture. There were three people. It was Bob, another young man, another young woman, leaning against a car on a bluff in Burns. It was his graduation day, if I remember correctly, from high school. And they all had a bottle of whiskey in their hands. He said, I don't remember who he is, but that cute girl is Norma Paulus. So they were classmates in high school together, and I never told this to the congressman, but before I left, after I cataloged those photos, I went to the photocopy machine and I took a photocopy of that picture that I may still have someplace. It was a black and white photo, and I may have lost it in my own fire a while ago, but somewhere I may still have a picture of a photocopy of a picture of Bob Smith and Norma Paulus together drinking on a bluff in Burns, Oregon. So.
Thank you. You know, he was a great mentor for her when she got into the legislature. The first 2 sessions that she was in were Republican-led, and Bob was the Speaker of the House. And then in 73, I guess 75, it changed to a Democratic-led House, which was partly what triggered her decision to run for Secretary of State, because she was in the minority party. I need to read the Nowhere.
Well, but just let me say, she specifically talks about that passing the whiskey bottle around.
Yes, she does.
It's
That's
right
right.
there in the oral history.
Yeah,
so.
and you don't refuse,
And don't
she said.
wipe up. Don't see let them see you wipe it.
Yeah, that's
just
that's
read it.
the neighborly thing to do. Yeah. So let me read about the Nowhere Loves Norma. That is really a cool story. So she's running for governor against Neil Goldschmidt. And it's a very, very, very close race. And it's really difficult economic times. Though an Oregon native, Goldschmidt was widely viewed as a liberal, big city, Eastern-affiliated politician. He had a sturdy following in Portland in the Willamette Valley, but was less well-liked east of the Cascades. Norma may not have been born in Oregon, but she grew up in Burns, and her small-town credentials played well with the farmers, ranchers, and small business owners on the east side. She proposed a debate schedule that included Bend, where these advantages would show up well. Goldschmidt surely knew this as well as Norma did. He was game for the debate, but resisted the venue. In an August 6th interview with KOIN-TV in Portland, he said, "Let's do these debates where they'll do some good. Quit pretending a debate in the middle of nowhere and where nobody can watch it is a real debate." This remark created a righteous furor in Bend and points east. "We do not think of ourselves as living in the middle of nowhere," wrote H. Bruce Miller in the Bend Bulletin, with tongue only slightly in cheek. "On the contrary, we think of Bend as a pretty sophisticated and cosmopolitan place, boasting a Wendy's, a McDonald's, a Kentucky Fried Chicken, and a Dairy Queen, and for the more gastronomically adventurous, Mexican, Chinese, and even Polish food. And," he added, "we are about to get our own full-service car wash." Another thing, since Bend is approximately in the middle of Oregon, Goldschmidt must think Oregon is nowhere. The only possible, now why would a man want to be governor of nowhere? This is the same newspaper man talking. "The only possible reason is that Neil hopes someday to parlay it into another, better job somewhere," with a capital S. The next day, Norma held a press conference and demanded an apology. Later, she accused Goldschmidt of wanting to be, quote unquote, the governor of Portland. 2 weeks later, Goldschmidt made a special trip to Bend and apologized. "The last 2 weeks have been painful for me," he said. "If you want to know how painful, it is not easy to dislodge a size 11 foot from one's mouth." The crowd included Paulus supporters waving signs that said, "Nowhere loves Norma." So.
Any more questions? Yes.
Well, I'm Ann Lau, and I was Norma's secretary during her legislative career. And then Phyllis and I, she was also a legislative secretary. We shared the job of being secretary while she was in the legislature.
Would you come up
We
and...
probably spent more time with Norma than any.
Yes.
Anyway, one thing I particularly thought about Norma was.
Would you mind coming up and letting people see you and hear?
Well, we enjoyed working for Norma, and we enjoyed sharing our job. And
This is Ann Lau.
Ann Lau and Phyllis Elgin. Anyway, one thing we got to do was go to all of her speeches with her, take her and hear all her speeches. So over a period of 8 years as Secretary of State and other years as her representative secretary, I never heard her give a bad speech. She was such a good speaker. And it was a lot of fun. I had known her before I ever became her secretary, so I have known her for a long, long time.
You helped on her campaign, did you?
Yes, I
Her
worked
legislative-
on her campaign.
That's right, yeah.
So it's been a lot of fun knowing her through her career.
Thank you.
But Norma cites another section I was going to read. Well, I was just going to read you the whole thing,
Yes,
actually.
I
But
know.
another section,
yourselves comfortable.
she talks about one of her real objectives going into Secretary of State was to find a way to job share, for women to share jobs so some of them could be at home with their kids more. And so, yeah. And she did it. You're the living proof.
Yes.
She said it worked really well.
Well, and it took some doing. I mean,
It
she
did,
Yeah, she had
to get them to
yeah.
split the salaries and to make sure that both of you got benefits and, yeah.
And they came
She
back,
fought
and they
for it.
came back and said, well, we can't do that, you know, because it's just splitting the benefits is too hard. And she said, find a way. And that was Norma.
Of course, it was done.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both for a good hour of fond memories for me. I still have the brass floor lamp from the mental hospital in Pendleton from the garage sale.
You got that.
I got that, and it's still proud in my living room with much better shade. But it still works just fine. And there's a lot of legacy of Norma's throughout this building, throughout the state, not the least of which is vote by mail. Many, many other wonderful memories of her service and legacy. So thank you. Pam and Gail are going to be available in the Galleria for coffee, and they have coffee and cookies and copies of the book for sale, and they'll be happy to sign them.
Great, it's Pat, actually.
Pat, sorry. Oh, God.
I'd like to
Got
note
my
that
notes.
the oral history is available. If you go to the Oregon History Society, they have all the oral history archived. It can be read by anyone. So, yes. It's a good read. Thank you.